Good afternoon, folks. Richard Ewing is my name. I built that. A friend of mine asked me about it and he said, so did you build it sort of just from make your own parts or did you get a kit? And I said, oh, no, I got a kit. The aeroplane's actually made, the kit is made in Oshkosh in the States. So yeah, I've been to the factory a couple of times. And he said, oh, a kit, so you just get it and put it together. And I said, yeah, but I'm a bit of a slow person. It took me 5 years to put it together. So yeah, there's a bit of an issue there. I ordered it in 2011. When we went to Oshkosh, which is about August, I popped in to see the guy that I'd spoken to a few times on the phone. And Mark said to me, oh, Richard, he said, what a shame. He said, your kit was here. We put it on the truck yesterday. So, you know, the old surfer's story of you should have been here yesterday. Anyway, I said, yeah, righto, well, I'm sure I'll catch up with it when it turns up. Well, in about November, courtesy of the SS Margaret River and a few trucks and trains and what have you, it arrived. What I wasn't really ready for was the people from the various importers, and this guy rang me up and he said, I'm your agent. And I said, what do I need an agent for? And he said, oh, there's a few fees. Bloody hell, was there a few fees? You finished up, I'm sure, buying flowers and chocolates for the customs officers' girlfriends and everything. But I do remember there was about 19 items on the list, which was a lot. Anyway, we put it together. I built it over 5 years at home. My wife, my very understanding wife, sacrificed her patio for 5 years. Was really delighted to see it go. The only thing was there was a path that went out through the garage, the back of the garage, as a single, and we had to take it out through there. Well, she planted some plants, and in the 5 years they'd grown up quite a bit. So I had to trim those to get it out. And a really good mate of mine, Jamie Gard, was giving me a hand. He said, hey Richard, what time does Margaret get home? And I said, well, I don't know. Why? And he said, I don't want to be here when she gets back. The nice little part of that was those flowers blossomed. Now, I didn't say so at the time. I know nothing about gardening. I know grass and flowers, but I claimed all the credit for that. Scientific pruning. I'd looked it up on the internet. Anyway, I got away with that one. So off we went, and the first flight was 2018. I'd like to say it went without a hitch, but it didn't. My background, incidentally, is just a private pilot, but I was fortunate enough to get involved in flying skydivers. Glorified lift driver, really. Didn't do very much cross-country flying, but I did a lot of ups and downs, and an awful lot of takeoffs and landings, which was just as well. The engine for this little chariot is a big bore Volkswagen. The options were you could buy a Jabiru. At the time, Jabiru didn't have the best reputation in the world, and I'd built lots of Volkswagens. I'm a motor mechanic by trade, TAFE lecturer by profession in the automotive area, so the Volkswagen held no surprises for me. So we put it together, and a mate of mine came and put his together at the same time. It's a 2.2 litre engine as opposed to the normal V-dub, which was about 1.4, 1.6 and even 1.8 litres. So it's a pretty big engine as Volkswagens go. It was alleged to produce 80 horsepower. If it ever made better than 65, I would have been very surprised. The rate of climb was gentle. Okay, one of the early problems was a thing called the aero injector. About as much of an injector as I am. It was a very, very simple little carburettor. Very similar to an Amel motorcycle carburettor for those of you that might be inclined that way. It gave various issues, and I finally replaced it with a unit that was made in Victoria from a mop called Rotac, as distinct from Rotax, who make the engine. More on that later too. Australian design, and as I say, manufactured in Victoria. huge amount of work involved in redesigning the fuel system because things had to go in different places, fuel pumps and what have you. But it solved the running problems that I had, solved the overheating problems that I had, and it test flew very, very well. So from that sort of debugging exercise that lasted perhaps 6 months, I got in the aeroplane and flew it for quite a while with almost no issues. However, there was unfortunately just one incident. So here was the little girl parked out the front of the hangar, all ready to go. The mission was Jandakot to Bunbury, breakfast at Bunbury, and off I was ready to go. So we fired it up and we're going to Jandakot. Now, for those of you that fly out of Jandakot, you wouldn't have any problem with this particular diagram. That's the layout of the 2 runways that you can see that are facing 24 Southwest 06. It was an early start, early for me, before 8 o'clock. The tower operates at 8 o'clock. So I've got in the aeroplane, fired it up, behaving itself very well, no problems. So off we go. Taxied to 24 right. Very fortunate little part of the exercise, uncontrolled before 8 o'clock, and I've called up all stations for 24 right because I was going from the top of the picture up there. Just seconds after me, another guy called up to say, I was taxiing for 06. There was basically no wind. I was taxiing for 06, but that's all right, I'll make it to 24, which is good. I was up that end, he was the other end, but he was a nice chap. And that made a huge difference to what was going to happen now. As I said, nothing much at all. And apart from this significant little exercise, I'd run up the engine, nothing was amiss. Did all the pre-takeoff checks, set it up, moved onto the runway. And I hope you can see my little blue line that I've put on there. The blue line represents my progress. Okay, so that represents my takeoff roll. I moved onto the runway, and just before I did, the tower came on the air. It was 8 o'clock. I called up all stations and he came back to me and said, Echo Golf Papa, tower's on the air, you are clear for takeoff 24 right. So I got onto 24 right, opened up the power and charged off, happy that I was going down to have breakfast at Bunbury. Not a problem. So we rotate at about that point where the H is, the helicopters. I rotated the little girl at about 60 knots, lifted off, and then lowered the nose and let the aeroplane accelerate because it climbed best at about 85 knots. So it was consuming, yeah, a fair bit of runway, but that's all right. Done it plenty of times, and where that little symbol is at the end of the runway, okay, around about level with that, I was now seriously looking at turning towards Lake Yangebup, which is the standard deal. Now, I was probably only at about 200 feet when I'm doing this. So I'm looking to turn towards Lake Yangebup. There's the turn, I'm underway, and now I've got to getting up towards 300 feet. Now, I know I'm not really supposed to do that. You're supposed to get to 500 feet before you turn. But if I did that, the tower kind of understood you get in the way of the traffic on the other runway. So I'm climbing like a rocket at 350 or 400 feet a minute, which is the best I could do. And we are running along there, now up to 85 knots. So that's all going fairly well. You can see that if I glance down, as I did, there's runway 12 underneath me, which was just as well because right at that point, the engine coughed. It only coughed once, and I thought, holy Toledo, or gosh, or golly, or something similar to that. And the RPM picked up again and then stopped completely. Now at this stage, I glanced at two things: the altimeter, 320 feet, the airspeed indicator, 85 knots. Don't turn back. Yeah, right. I'm going to crash the light of my life? I don't think so, Tim. So I've looked down at runway 12 and I thought, I can make that, I think. Bear in mind, I have had a lot of practice. As a glorified lift driver, I actually counted them up. I got over 5,000 takeoffs and landings. Not much else, but yeah, a lot of that. And there we are with an engine that now has quit completely. So we started the turn. One of the warnings from a dear friend of mine came back. I took a run just before I flew this the first time, and she said, Richard, whatever you do, don't remember, these little things haven't got any inertia. So what you're going to have to do if you lose the engine is stuff the nose down. Otherwise it'll slow right down, fall out of the sky. Quite right too. But remember, this thing didn't fall out of the sky until it got to about 38 knots. So at a pretty fat margin. That turn is a tight turn with the nose well down. I am aiming to land on runway 12. I don't think I'm going to make it, but there's a nice gravel undershoot. There we are. And that was about the touchdown point and the touchdown direction. By the time I got to the point where that was going to be it, I'd run out of most things. There was almost no altitude left. There was not much airspeed left. It was doing about 58 knots. And I thought that was close enough. Didn't have any flap down, no requirement for that. And the tower had contacted me and said, Echo Golf Papa, are you ops normal? So I just said negative. And that's all he got. And jolly good chap he was too, because he didn't really do anything more, just sat and watched and said, oh, geez. But as it turned out, I touched down probably about 25, 30 degrees offline, right on the right-hand side of the undershoot. Fairly gently, and things are looking pretty good. So I thought, yeah, we'll take that. I realised at that time I hadn't turned the fuel off, I hadn't talked to anybody, I hadn't turned the switches off, and I thought, well, it's probably too late to do that now anyway, so we'll keep going. And I touched down on the undershoot. Next thing that was terribly important, when you run onto the runway, whatever you do, don't run over a runway light. You'd have to sell the whole bloody aeroplane to Page Endicott Airport for their runway light if you did. So I missed it. Okay, well there was the touchdown moment and the roll through. And doing my best Bob Hoover impression, very famous aerobatic pilot who's well known for coming in dead stick and parking his aeroplane exactly right. Difference between Bob Hoover, he was very good, I was just very lucky. Anyway, the aeroplane rolled onto runway 12, and at that stage I thought, okay, I've got to that taxiway Sierra, turned off there. The propeller had stopped because obviously the engine had quit, it slowed down enough, the propeller had stopped. And so did I, and at that stage I can tell you folks, you reflect a lot on what happened in the last 30 seconds or so. So I called up the tower and said, yeah, sorry about that. I said, just give me a few minutes to sort myself out here and I'll try and get it to go. Well, it did. We got it to go and it fired up quite nicely. And I'm thinking, right, because now you can. You've got a whole aeroplane still. So I've taken it back to the hangar and parked it. Did I sit down and calmly take a photo? No, I just picked that out from something else. But by now you do, because you realise that if you're flying an Aero Club aeroplane and assuming you survived, what is your job now? Glenn Capel's problem. So you just fill in something sufficiently intelligent on the maintenance release, hand it to the girls, fill in some numbers, pay the bill and rack off. Unfortunately, I owned this thing that chose not to run and then did run. So where do you go from there? Call the aircraft maintenance engineer. Oh yeah, that's me. Fortunately, as I said, my background is a motor mechanic and I'm a TAFE lecturer in the automotive area, so I'm supposed to know about things like that. Turned it over, 4 nice solid compressions. Let's face it, an engine's got to have air and fuel and a spark to run. Well, that's all right, I started it up and it did run. So in the end, we set to and ran the engine up on the tarmac. Ran it up to full power, ran like a clock. So I thought back to it and I thought, hang on a minute, you had the boost pump on. And there it was, folks. Turned the boost pump on, ran it to full throttle, had just a little bit too much fuel, and it just cut. When I pushed the throttle hard open, it just cut. We could reproduce it time and time again. Take it to full throttle with no boost pump, okay, ran like a charm. Put the boost pump on and don't quite take it to hard full throttle, ran like a charm. Push that last little bit and it cut out. Well, that was easy to fix, wasn't it? Make a note in the aircraft flight manual and the handling notes that say, do not use boost pump on takeoff. Boost pump at full throttle may cause the engine to quit. There was the issue. So there was me. I was now kind of happy that it was ready to go. And I thought, well, that was fine. But just to fill you in on the last little bit of the exercise, the same lady that I had taken flying in Bustleton prior to my flying at young Karen Dorland, who's a really good RAOS instructor, was coming along for a ride with me. We were going to Rottnest. So off we went. And I said, yeah, go on, you take it, fly it down. She said, yeah, it's a little nervous, isn't it, Richard? And I said, I prefer the term manoeuvrable, Karen, but yeah, it is. But she flew it better than I did. And she took it down to Rockingham and Mandurah and back again over to Rottnest, started the descent and said, well, you better put it down on the ground at Rotto because I might break it. And so I put it down at Rotto, fortunately nice landing, touchdown, turned off the turned off the runway at least, and all of a sudden there was a nasty clack crunch out of the engine and it was running on 3. Some of you might be familiar with this particular problem. That's a photograph of the valves in the engine. Now, because the cylinder head is made of aluminum in America, those little seats that you can see under the valves, or at least under one of them, they're hard enough to look after that. The one that's not under the valve is the one that fell out. And at that cylinder, there's no compression. Karen, being an aircraft owner and somebody with a great sense of humour, said, well, this is all right, I've never caught the ferry home. So, and then looked at me and she said, well, don't look at me. She said, I flew the thing for about 3/4 of an hour, I gave it back to you and you busted it. Which is pretty accurate, really. The short story, just quickly, I took it back to some engine reconditioners who'd been recommended to me, took both of the cylinder heads off. Oh, incidentally, I did bring a spare head over, put it back on and flew it back to Jandakot after we'd done a lot of circling around to make sure it wasn't going to stop. Then I got that done, put those back on, ran like a champion for the test ride. Ran on a run down to Serpentine, and then one further run around, and I went to start it for the 4th flight, running on 3. And at that stage, no, that was it. It had dropped a valve seat again, and the engine was sacked. For those of you that are enthusiasts for the brand, and I am now, that's a Rotax engine, Austrian engine, a real aeroplane engine. And people keep saying to me, when will you get the aeroplane back in the air, Richard? And the answer is, look, probably in about 6 weeks. Trouble is, I've been saying that for the last 6 months. However, I'm here to tell you that I think it'll be back in the air in 6 weeks' time with a much better engine that will have a real 100 horsepower. The aircraft insurance people were so happy with my decision that the cost of a year's insurance has gone from $3,300 to $1,800. They don't regard the Volkswagen very highly. So there she is. That's as far as we've gone, folks. I'll let you know when we get it back in the air. Thank you very much.